Hi everyone, it's Dennis, the coder from Eracat. Well, not really. He's not much of a talker, so he's using me as a puppet. We'll be discussing the code for this episode, so what I discuss here will make absolutely no sense to my artist brain. So what I say from here on is from Dennis's perspective. Enjoy! So, I'll be showing you a few of the inner workings of the game we've put together so far, and hopefully the coders in the audience can give me a pointer or two. Or at least don't form a lynch mob for every semicolon I've misused. Also, on a side note, sorry this episode came out a few days later than usual. It was probably a bad idea for us to get Fall Guys and a VR headset on the same day. But don't worry, we've locked them in the basement for now so we can get back to work. Anyway, with that aside, let's get back into the meat of the video. As I'm currently only familiar with coding in C#, besides a little knowledge in Unreal Engine Blueprint visual sculpting system, I'll be using the Unity engine. After starting up Unity and creating some folders to organise all the assets we're going to need for the game, the first thing I did was start working on one of the game's core mechanics: traits. Specifically defining what a trait is, and being able to assign traits to the main character so they can affect the way the player goes about playing. For this, I first needed to create the character for our game, so I imported the player sprites that Zach so kindly put together in the previous episode, and created the player object in Unity, giving it a sprite renderer, and while I was at it, a rigid body 2D and a box collider 2D, to act as trigger rather than the hitboxes later down the line. I'm going to need those for making the character move and triggering certain events in the game. Okay, so now we have the player object in all his glory, but he's missing just one tiny little thing: a brain, or more accurately, a script to let us assign things like a name, stats, list of obtained traits, method to execute when called. I started the script by laying out some variables the player is going to need, like integers to represent the current and maximum values of HP and stamina, as well as a string to store the player's name. I also made it so the player object isn't destroyed between loading levels, and their current stats are set to be equal to their maximum stats on the player's creation. E.g., under normal circumstances, the player's current HP will be set to 15 at the start of each game. At some point in future, I may have a look at making stats a class rather than just a couple of integers, as it will have more flexibility in how I can use them when it comes to combat. I learned about doing it in this sort of way from watching Bracky's video on YouTube. I know if you're here, you already likely know who he is, but if you don't and are interested in creating your own games, I'd go and check out his videos after this. Not sponsored, by the way. Anyway, before I create all the important lists of traits to keep track of what traits are currently acting upon the player, I have to define what a trait is, by creating a trait class. So I'll come back to the player script shortly. Now that I have the player character in a decent place, I'm just going to throw together an environment for the scene quickly out of some of the aforementioned art assets made in the previous episode. Though an environment isn't strictly required for what I'm trying to achieve, I just thought it would look pretty for the devlog, and I'll have to do it at some point anyway. Before I make a start on the script to make the trait class we use in various other scripts that will reference or use the traits in some way, I decided to create a UI canvas so it could add some simple text UI elements. Also, so I don't commit the heinous sin of using plain Arial font in a game. We looked for a nicer font online, and after some conferring with Zach, we decided to use Amatic SC, at least for now. We may find another good font to pair with it in future. Back on the coding end, to define traits in the scripts, I put together a class with some of the common things a trait will need in this game. All traits will have a string containing its name and alignment, whether positive or negative, which I use a boolean to represent. Though not all traits will have an effect on specific stats, I've included a string to record the stat a trait affects and an integer to say what value it will tweak the affected stat by. Topping this off, I added one last boolean to say whether or not a trait has altered the player so something can't have the trait triggering multiple times. This class is likely to be altered a decent bit in the future as I figure out optimizations and change it to suit the game's needs. One thing I'm thinking of is changing it up by having a couple of child classes for positive and negative traits, which derive from the original trait class, so I can drop the alignment boolean and it would give me a few more options. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. This class will work for now. With one quick addition to the player script, we will have a list of traits which can be added to and taken away from. So, with all this, we have a player that has a name and stats, as well as a list for all of his traits, a nice environment to put the player in while we assign random traits at the beginning of the game, and some UI to give the player an idea of what's going on. All we need now to reach our goal is for a script to create traits and sort them into lists, and scripts to manage the scene and interact with the player by changing UI text and randomly assigning traits. The trait sorting script is a pretty simple task. With the trait class done, all I have to do is create a trait management script, a few lists of the different types of traits, and have a method to create positive and negative traits before they're sorted into their respective lists via for loop. I gave it some parameters for just a few of the traits in our game for now, like big, strong, fat, and flimsy, but eventually it'll be much more vast. All that's left before we actually get to see this in action is the script that manages the scene. The final scene management script does a few things. It stores and manages the text prompts, creates an instance of the player object created at the start of this episode, randomly selects and moves traits from the trait manager to the player script, and stores a name typed in by the user before assigning it to the player using a piece of UI called the input field. The scene manager script is a bit longer than some of the earlier ones I talked about, so I'll just leave it at that explanation as to not bore the people that are waiting for Zach to start drawing again. Okay, so that's it. We've covered everything we need for the functioning traits assignment scene, so let's see what we can do. So the player spawns and the text at the top of the screen prompts the user to use the input field to name his current player character. One thing I forgot to mention was that I also have stored a little list of preset names for the input field to use if the user doesn't mind what their name is, as well as a basic randomize button to pick a new name from this list. Anyway, once a name is entered and the player's name is assigned, the text prompt asks what traits define you. By pressing space, traits are assigned one by one and added to the player. While this isn't all that we've done so far, we're going to leave it here so that we can talk about it a bit more when we've actually got it all nice and shiny in the future episodes. For now, this is Dennis signing off. Well, that was indecipherable for me. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you, like me, don't really understand much about coding, the next episode will try and have more art with code mixed in. If you liked what you saw, you can check our Twitter at EricAdDev, and every like, comment and subscriber pushes us one step closer into the spotlight. And if you're feeling extra generous, we've also set up a Patreon, which will help fund our endeavour to create a fun and wholesome game. With that said, I'd like to thank the first two patrons, Paul Val and my mum. Thanks, Mum. See the rest of you in the next episode.